The hikers found her shelter in October 1882, 12 miles deep in the North Carolina mountains. Inside the crude structure, a girl who had vanished 4 years earlier sat drawing on dirt walls. What she had endured in that isolation would expose how wealth and distance could hide unspeakable crimes. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. September 1878 arrived in Watauga County with heavy clouds that hung low over the mountain valleys. The Dunsworth family cabin sat on a steep hillside, one of several tenant properties scattered across land owned by the Vesey family. For 3 generations, families like the Dunsworths had worked these holdings, paying their rent through labor and a share of whatever crops the rocky soil would yield. Cora Dunsworth had turned 7 that summer. She was a quiet child, with dark hair that her mother braided each morning, careful and methodical despite the family's poverty. On that September afternoon, her mother sent her to fetch water from the creek that ran through the hollow below their property. The path was well worn, traveled daily by the family, considered safe despite the isolation that defined mountain life in that era. When Cora didn't return by sunset, her father walked the path 3 times, calling her name into the gathering darkness. He found the wooden bucket near the creek bank, half filled with water, as though she had been interrupted mid-task. Nothing else. No torn fabric, no signs of struggle, no indication of what had drawn her away from that spot. By morning, neighbors from 3 valleys had gathered to search. The Appalachian community, for all its scattered homesteads and difficult terrain, maintained networks of mutual aid that activated in times of crisis. Men walked in careful lines through the forest. Women checked every root cellar, every abandoned structure, every place a frightened child might hide. The Vesey family, whose wealth set them apart from their tenants, sent their own men to assist, including Luther Vesey, the patriarch's younger brother, who lived in a cabin on a distant tract of family land. The search continued for 6 days. Autumn rains arrived on the 3rd day, washing away any tracks that might have remained. Local authorities, such as they were in that remote county, documented the case with the kind of resigned practicality that came from understanding how quickly the mountains could claim someone. Sheriff Gable wrote in his report that the child had likely fallen victim to wild animals or had slipped into the creek during a moment of inattention, her small body carried downstream by currents swollen from recent storms. No body was ever found. The community held no funeral because there was nothing to bury. The Dunsworths returned to their daily labor because tenant farmers had no luxury of extended mourning. Cora's mother kept her daughter's few possessions in a wooden box beneath the bed. Her father stopped speaking her name aloud, as though silence might somehow lessen the weight of not knowing. The case was filed away in the county records. A 7-year-old girl disappeared, presumed dead. Just another tragedy in a region where distance and poverty made tragedy common. The mountains held their secrets, and the living had no choice but to continue on. The years that followed Cora's disappearance transformed the Dunsworth family in ways that neighbors could measure but not name. Her mother, Ada, began spending hours at the window that faced the creek path, her hands idle in her lap, a posture foreign to a woman whose survival had always demanded constant motion. Her father, Emmett, worked the Vesey land with increased intensity, as though exhaustion might provide what sleep no longer could. 2 younger children had been born before Cora vanished. They grew older in a household marked by careful silence, learning without instruction which subjects remained forbidden. The wooden box beneath their parents' bed was never opened in their presence, but they understood its significance the way children understand all unspoken family rules. The community's response to the tragedy followed predictable patterns. In the first months, neighbors brought food and offered prayers. By the second year, most had stopped mentioning Cora's name in the Dunsworth's presence, interpreting the family's stoic silence as a request for privacy rather than what it truly was: the exhausted aftermath of hope repeatedly disappointed. Mountain people understood that some losses defied consolation. Luther Vesey continued his periodic visits to the tenant families, a practice he'd maintained for years as part of the family's oversight of their properties. He brought news from the county seat, delivered messages, sometimes offered small assistance with repairs or supplies. His presence was unremarkable, accepted as part of the social structure that governed relationships between landowners and tenants. Yet certain details emerged in retrospect that went unexamined at the time. Luther had been particularly helpful during the initial search, volunteering his knowledge of the remote tracts and hollows that comprised the Vesey holdings. He had suggested search areas, accompanied search parties, expressed appropriate distress at the lack of findings. His concerns seemed genuine, his efforts extensive. In the third year after Cora's disappearance, travelers passing through the region began reporting occasional sightings that sparked brief renewals of hope. A girl matching Cora's age and description had been seen near a remote homestead in the next county. Another traveler claimed to have encountered a child alone in the forest, too far from any settlement to make sense. Each report was investigated by Sheriff Gable or his deputies, and each proved either mistaken identity or fabrication, the kind of false sightings that plague any well-known disappearance. The Dunsworths investigated several of these reports personally, traveling distances that cost them workdays they could not afford to lose. Ada would study each child's face with desperate attention, searching for some remnant of the daughter she'd last seen at 7 years old. The disappointments accumulated, each one adding weight to the resignation that had become their daily burden. By the fourth year, the community had largely accepted Cora's death as fact, even without a body to confirm it. The mountains claimed people. This was understood. Children wandered off paths, fell into ravines, encountered dangers that left no trace. The frequency of such tragedies did not diminish their impact, but it did create a framework for processing them. Life continued because it had to. Luther Vesey's visits to the Dunsworth property became less frequent during this period, though he maintained contact with other tenant families. When he did stop by, he inquired politely about the family's welfare, offered condolences that had become routine, asked after the younger children. Nothing in his manner suggested anything beyond appropriate sympathy for a tenant family's loss. The Vesey family maintained their position as the county's most prominent landowners. The patriarch, Luther's older brother, oversaw extensive holdings and wielded influence that extended into county governance and law enforcement. This influence was rarely exercised overtly, but its presence shaped every interaction between the wealthy and those who depended on them for land and livelihood. In October 1882, the 4th anniversary of Cora's disappearance approached. Ada Dunsworth continued her vigil at the window. Emmett continued his labor in the fields. The younger children continued their growth into a family structure permanently altered by absence. None of them knew that 12 miles distant, in a hollow so remote that even hunters rarely ventured there, their daughter and sister was still alive. The isolation that had hidden her captivity for 4 years was about to be breached by 2 men whose presence in those mountains was purely accidental. Their discovery would transform a closed case of presumed death into something far more disturbing, exposing not just one man's actions, but the systems that had allowed those actions to continue undetected. Thomas Ridgway and Benjamin Strait had been surveying potential railway routes through the North Carolina mountains for 3 weeks when they deviated from their planned path. The railroad company that employed them was exploring whether the terrain could support track construction, a question that required detailed mapping of elevations, water sources, and the feasibility of cutting through particular ridges. On the afternoon of October 15th, 1882, they found themselves in a hollow that appeared on no map they carried. The descent had been steep, following what might have once been a game trail, but showed no signs of recent use. Ridgway, the senior surveyor, had wanted to verify a water source that might serve future construction. What they found instead would end their surveying work for that season. The shelter was constructed against a rock outcropping, using materials that showed deliberate selection. Rough-hewn logs formed 3 walls, while the stone face provided the 4th. The roof consisted of bark and branches layered thick enough to shed rain. From a distance, it would have been nearly invisible, blending into the forest with the kind of camouflage that suggested intentional concealment rather than casual construction. Strait noticed it first, pointing out the unnatural angles where the structure met the rock. They approached cautiously, calling out in case it housed a hermit or squatter who might react poorly to strangers. No response came. When they reached the entrance, a gap barely wide enough for a grown man to pass through, they found it covered by a heavy piece of canvas weighted with stones. Ridgway pulled the canvas aside. The interior was dim, lit only by gaps in the roof structure. As their eyes adjusted, they saw her, a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, sitting against the far wall. She wore a dress so tattered and stained it was barely recognizable as clothing. Her hair hung in matted tangles past her shoulders. When their silhouettes blocked the entrance light, she pressed herself harder against the stone, making a sound that was not quite speech, but conveyed unmistakable terror. Both men froze. Strait later told authorities that his first thought was that they had stumbled upon some kind of ghost or forest spirit. So unexpected was the sight of a child in that remote location. Ridgway recovered first, stepping back from the entrance and speaking in what he hoped was a calming voice, explaining that they meant no harm, that they were simply passing through. The girl did not respond with words. She watched them with an expression that Ridgway described in his subsequent testimony as more animal than human, the look of something that had learned to expect only threats from any encounter. Her hands moved constantly, picking at the dirt floor, tracing patterns that made no sense to the observers. Strait circled the structure's exterior, while Ridgway maintained his position at the entrance, continuing to speak in low, steady tones. Behind the shelter, Strait found evidence of recent visits. Supplies stored in a wooden crate, protected from weather by an oiled tarp. The crate contained dried beans, cornmeal, and preserved meat, provisions that could sustain someone for weeks. Nearby, a small pile of firewood had been stacked with care, each piece cut to similar lengths. Someone had been maintaining this place. Someone had been keeping this child supplied, but isolated, hidden in a location that required significant knowledge of the terrain to even locate. The implications were immediately clear to both men, though neither spoke them aloud in that moment. Ridgway attempted to coax the girl toward the entrance with offers of food from their own supplies. She remained motionless except for her hands, which continued their repetitive movements in the dirt. Her eyes tracked every motion the men made, but she showed no recognition of their speech, no response to questions about her name or how she came to be there. After an hour of attempted communication, the men made a decision. Straight would remain with the girl, while Ridgway made the difficult journey back to the nearest settlement to bring authorities. They could not simply leave her there, and attempting to forcibly remove her seemed likely to cause more harm than waiting for proper assistance. Ridgway marked his trail carefully as he climbed out of the hollow, knowing that others would need to find this location again. The terrain was treacherous enough that he nearly lost his footing twice during the ascent. By the time he reached recognizable landmarks, darkness was approaching. He would not reach the settlement until the following day. Behind him, in the hidden hollow, Straight settled in to wait, maintaining his distance from the shelter's entrance, while the girl inside remained pressed against the stone wall. Neither of them slept that night. The sounds of the forest filled the darkness, and somewhere in those sounds was the absence that defined the mystery. Where was the person who had been bringing those supplies? And when would they return to find strangers had discovered their secret? Sheriff Gable received Ridgway's report with the kind of skepticism that came from years of processing mountain rumors and exaggerated claims. A child living alone in a remote shelter seemed more likely to be a disturbed vagrant or a runaway than the subject of any criminal matter. Still, the surveyor's credibility and the specific details he provided warranted investigation. The party that returned to the hollow on October 17th included Sheriff Gable, his deputy, Ridgway, and a doctor from the county seat named Horace Latimer. The journey took most of the day, following the markers Ridgway had left during his departure. When they finally descended into the hidden valley, they found Straight sitting 30 feet from the shelter entrance, exhausted but alert. He reported that the girl had not emerged during his entire vigil, though he had heard movement inside and had continued leaving food near the entrance. Dr. Latimer approached the shelter first, speaking gently and identifying himself as someone who helped people when they were hurt or sick. The girl remained silent, but after nearly an hour of patient communication, she allowed him to enter the dim interior. His examination, conducted with extreme care given her obvious fear, revealed a child in poor physical condition, but without recent injuries. What concerned him more was her inability to communicate beyond basic sounds and her complete lack of response to simple questions. The distinctive birthmark on her left shoulder blade became the crucial detail. It was roughly circular, about the size of a silver dollar, darker than the surrounding skin. When Sheriff Gable saw it, something shifted in his expression. He asked Ridgway and Straight to wait outside, then spent several minutes reviewing notes from a leather case he'd brought with him. 4 years earlier, when documenting Cora Dunsworth's disappearance, he had recorded identifying features provided by her parents. The birthmark's description matched exactly. The age progression aligned. The last known clothing description bore similarities to the remnants of fabric the girl wore, though 4 years of wear had rendered the garment nearly unrecognizable. Sheriff Gable dispatched his deputy to bring the Dunsworth family to the hollow. The journey would take time, and the distance created hours of waiting weighted with possibility and dread. Dr. Latimer remained with the girl, gradually establishing enough trust that she accepted water and small amounts of food. She never spoke, but her eyes showed awareness, intelligence operating behind walls that trauma had constructed. Ada and Emmett Dunsworth arrived as twilight gathered in the hollow. Their younger children had been left with neighbors, spared from whatever this discovery might reveal. Ada's first sight of the girl produced a sound that Straight would later describe as something between recognition and grief. She moved toward the shelter, but Sheriff Gable stopped her, explaining gently that the child was extremely frightened and that any sudden approach might cause more distress. Instead, Ada stood at the entrance and began speaking. She talked about the morning Cora had last left their cabin, about the braiding of her hair, about the wooden bucket by the creek. She described the box beneath the bed, where Cora's few possessions remained untouched. She spoke names of neighbors, of relatives, of small details from a 7-year-old's life. The girl's hands, which had maintained their constant movement in the dirt, gradually stilled. Her eyes fixed on Ada's face with an intensity that suggested some deep recognition struggling through layers of survival and fear. When Ada mentioned the birthmark, explaining how Cora had gotten sunburned around it one summer, the girl's hand moved to touch her own shoulder blade. Emmett Dunsworth had remained silent throughout this exchange, standing rigid as though movement might shatter whatever fragile connection was forming. When Sheriff Gable asked if he could confirm the birthmark's description, Emmett provided details that matched both the original report and what Dr. Latimer had observed. The location, the size, the particular shape that Ada had once said looked like a thumbprint. The identification process took hours. Dr. Latimer examined records Sheriff Gable had brought, comparing details against his observations. The age was correct for a child who had been 7 4 years earlier. The physical features, allowing for years of inadequate nutrition and exposure, aligned with the parents' descriptions. Most convincingly, Ada's continued speaking seemed to reach something in the child that responded, however minimally, with signs of recognition. By the time full darkness arrived, the consensus had formed. This was Cora Dunsworth, missing since September 1878, somehow surviving in isolation for 4 years. The immediate questions of how she had arrived in this hollow and who had maintained her captivity pressed urgently, but the first priority was removing her from this place and attempting to understand what she had endured. The girl allowed Ada to approach, though she flinched at touch and would not permit Ada or anyone to carry her. She walked out of the shelter on her own, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating dangerous territory. The group began the difficult journey out of the hollow in darkness, Dr. Latimer leading with a lantern while Ada walked beside the daughter she had believed dead, neither touching nor speaking, simply present in the same space again, after 4 years of absence. Behind them, Sheriff Gable posted his deputy to guard the shelter. Evidence needed to be preserved, and more urgently, whoever had been supplying that location might return. Sheriff Gable returned to the shelter at first light, with a team that included Dr. Latimer, 2 deputies, and a clerk from the county courthouse tasked with documenting everything they found. The isolation that had hidden this location for 4 years now worked in favor of evidence preservation. No rain had fallen since the discovery, and the deputy who had stood guard overnight reported no visitors or disturbances. The shelter's interior measured roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, large enough for a child, but cramped for an adult. The dirt floor showed patterns of repeated use, areas worn smooth by years of movement. In one corner, a collection of small stones had been arranged in designs that suggested both boredom and a mind-seeking order in captivity. Dr. Latimer noted these arrangements carefully, recognizing them as coping mechanisms he had observed in patients experiencing severe isolation. The walls told a more disturbing story. Crude drawings had been scratched into the wooden surfaces using rocks or sticks. Most depicted simple scenes: trees, animals, rough representations of human figures. But certain images appeared repeatedly with variations that suggested they documented specific memories or experiences. One drawing showed a small figure and a larger figure rendered in the basic style of a child's hand, appearing together in multiple scenes across different sections of wall. The larger figure in these drawings wore what appeared to be a hat, a detail that would prove significant. In some images, the two figures stood near what might represent the shelter. In others, they appeared to be walking through trees. The repetition suggested these were not fantasies, but representations of actual encounters, a visual record of the person who had been visiting this location. The supply crate yielded more concrete evidence. The provisions inside included items that could only have been purchased or obtained from settlements. The cornmeal bore the stamp of a mill in the county seat. The preserved meat had been prepared using methods common to the region, but requiring resources beyond what could be improvised in wilderness. Most significantly, the wooden crate itself had been constructed with manufactured nails, not hand-forged, indicating relatively recent origin. Behind the shelter, investigators found a narrow path leading deeper into the hollow. Following it for several hundred yards, they discovered a second, smaller cache of supplies, hidden beneath brush and covered with oiled canvas. This location contained items that had clearly been staged for later transport to the main shelter. Additional food stores, a wool blanket still folded, and a small leather satchel containing what appeared to be a child's worn shoes. The shoes stopped Sheriff Gable cold. They matched the description of what Cora Dunsworth had been wearing the day she disappeared. Ada had mentioned them specifically during the original investigation. Small boots with leather laces, one of which had been replaced with twine after the original broke. The left boot in this cache had twine instead of a leather lace. This discovery confirmed what had already been suspected, but not yet proven. Cora had not wandered into this hollow by accident. She had been brought here, deliberately, by someone who had then maintained her captivity with regular supply visits. The planning involved suggested premeditation, not an impulsive act. The investigators spent hours documenting the site's layout and contents. The path leading to and from the hollow showed signs of regular use, though not recent. Vegetation had begun reclaiming the trail in ways that suggested the last visit might have occurred weeks earlier. This raised urgent questions about when the person responsible had last checked on their captive, and whether Cora might have been left to starve if the surveyors had not accidentally discovered her. Dr. Latimer examined the drawings more closely, using his understanding of child development to estimate when different images had been created. The scratches varied in depth and technique in ways that suggested they had been made across an extended period. Early drawings were simpler, more primitive. Later ones showed increased skill and detail, documenting the artistic development of a child growing from 7 to 11 in isolation. One wall section contained markings that appeared to be an attempt at counting or record-keeping. Vertical scratches grouped in sets of 5, the universal method of tracking days or events. Dr. Latimer counted over 300 such marks before the pattern became too irregular to follow reliably. Whether these represented days, visits, or some other metric remained unclear. But they spoke to a mind trying to maintain structure in circumstances designed to eliminate it. The most chilling discovery came from the crawl space beneath the rock outcropping where the shelter had been built. One of the deputies, investigating what he thought might be a gap in the foundation, found a small collection of items wrapped in cloth and wedged into a natural crevice. The bundle contained objects that clearly belonged to Cora. A hair ribbon that Ada immediately recognized, a small carved wooden figure that Emmett confirmed he had made for his daughter's 6th birthday, and a piece of fabric torn from a dress Ada had sewn. These were not items a child would carry into the wilderness if she had wandered away. They were possessions from home, taken deliberately, held as tokens or trophies by whoever had orchestrated this captivity. Their presence in this hidden cache suggested the person responsible had visited the Dunsworth cabin, had been close enough to access Cora's belongings, had planned this abduction with enough forethought to collect items that would later prove identity or provide some psychological comfort to the captive child. Sheriff Gable ordered every item cataloged and preserved. The evidence they were gathering pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of both the Dunsworth family and the remote geography of these mountains. The list of people who fit that description was not long. The land records at the Watauga County Courthouse occupied 2 rooms on the 2nd floor, leather-bound volumes documenting decades of property transactions, inheritances, and boundary disputes. Sheriff Gable arrived there on October 19th with a specific question: who owned the remote hollow where Cora Dunsworth had been found? The clerk, a meticulous man named Virgil Tannen, spent 3 hours tracing ownership through various parcels and subdivisions. The Vesey family holdings sprawled across multiple townships, accumulated through generations of strategic purchases and foreclosures. The particular tract containing the hollow had been part of the original Vesey land grant from the 1790s, never sold or subdivided, listed in current records as unimproved forest. This discovery narrowed the investigation considerably. The Vesey family consisted of the patriarch, Edmund Vesey, who managed the family's business interests from his substantial home near the county seat, and his younger brother Luther, who had chosen a more solitary existence in a cabin on the family's remote holdings. Several cousins and their families also lived on Vesey properties, but none occupied land adjacent to the hollow in question. Sheriff Gable reviewed his notes from the original investigation in 1878. Luther Vesey had been among the most active participants in the search for Cora. He had volunteered detailed knowledge of the terrain, suggesting areas that other searchers had overlooked. He had spent days combing through remote sections of forest, returning each evening to report his lack of findings. His concern had seemed genuine, his efforts exhaustive. The sheriff made the journey to Luther's cabin that same afternoon. The property sat at the end of a rough track, accessible by wagon, but requiring careful navigation. The cabin itself was well maintained, larger than typical mountain dwellings, with a stone chimney and glazed windows that spoke to resources beyond what most residents possessed. Luther greeted the sheriff with apparent surprise and immediate questions about whether Cora had been found. When informed that she had been discovered alive in a remote hollow on Vesey land, his reaction struck Sheriff Gable as performative rather than authentic. The shock seemed rehearsed, the questions too carefully phrased, asking for details in ways that suggested he was trying to determine what evidence might exist, rather than expressing genuine concern for the child. The interview began casually, but grew more pointed as Sheriff Gable described the hollow's location in increasingly specific terms. Luther claimed unfamiliarity with that particular area, stating that the Vesey holdings were extensive, and he could not know every remote section. When asked about his movements over the past 4 years, he provided vague responses about hunting, timber surveying, and maintaining various boundary markers. Sheriff Gable noted inconsistencies immediately. Luther claimed he had not visited the southern sections of the property in months, yet he had mentioned hunting in that direction during a conversation the previous spring. He stated he always traveled alone, but several witnesses had seen him making regular trips with supplies that seemed excessive for solo expeditions. The questioning turned to the original search in 1878. Luther described his participation in detail, perhaps too much detail, recounting specific days and locations with precision that seemed unusual for events 4 years past. When Sheriff Gable mentioned that some searchers had noted Luther's particular knowledge of remote areas, Luther became defensive, insisting that his familiarity with the land was natural, given his residence there. A search of Luther's cabin, conducted with his reluctant permission, revealed items that demanded explanation. In a trunk beneath his bed, investigators found a leather journal containing entries that referenced visits to various locations on the property. Several entries from the past 4 years mentioned traveling to what Luther described as his southern boundary camp, visiting on a schedule that averaged every 2 to 3 weeks. More damning was a small wooden box hidden in the cabin's root cellar. Inside were items that Ada Dunsworth immediately identified as belonging to Cora: a cloth doll that had been a favorite toy, a hair comb that had gone missing from their cabin around the time of the disappearance, and a piece of embroidered fabric from a dress Ada had made. These were not items that would naturally come into Luther's possession through any legitimate means. When confronted with these discoveries, Luther's demeanor shifted from defensive to hostile. He claimed the items had been found during search efforts and kept as reminders of the tragedy, a deeply implausible explanation that Sheriff Gable did not pretend to accept. The journal entries, Luther insisted, referred to legitimate property maintenance, though he could provide no convincing explanation for why such routine activities required secretive notation. The sheriff's questions grew more direct. Had Luther visited the hollow where Cora was found? Luther denied it. Had he supplied the shelter with provisions? Another denial. Could he explain how items from the Dunsworth cabin came to be in his possession? He claimed faulty memory, suggested Ada might be mistaken about which items had been missing. Edmund Vesey arrived at his brother's cabin before the interview concluded, alerted by a neighbor who had seen the sheriff's visit. His presence immediately complicated the proceedings. Edmund was not merely a wealthy landowner, but a man whose influence extended into every aspect of county governance. He had business relationships with judges, social connections with officials, and economic leverage over numerous families, including, crucially, the sheriff's own extended family. Edmund demanded to know the basis for questioning his brother, insisted that any suspicions were unfounded, and made clear that continued harassment of a Vesey family member would have consequences. His intervention transformed what had been an investigation into a negotiation, one in which Sheriff Gable found his authority suddenly constrained by forces that had nothing to do with evidence or justice. The interview ended inconclusively, with Luther remaining in his cabin and Sheriff Gable returning to the county seat, with evidence that pointed clearly toward guilt, but without the institutional support necessary to pursue charges against someone of Luther Vesey's social standing. The case that had seemed straightforward in the hollow now revealed itself as something far more complex, entangled in the power structures that governed every aspect of life in Watauga County. The investigation expanded beyond physical evidence to testimonies that community members had been reluctant to provide before they understood the gravity of what had occurred. Sheriff Gable conducted interviews across 3 townships, speaking with tenant families, merchants, and anyone who had regular contact with Luther Vesey over the years preceding Cora's disappearance. A pattern emerged that was both clear and deeply disturbing. Multiple witnesses recalled Luther's unusual attention to the Dunsworth family, particularly after Cora's birth in 1871. Margaret Hensley, who lived on an adjacent property, remembered Luther stopping by the Dunsworth cabin frequently during Cora's early childhood, always with plausible excuses about property matters or delivering messages, but lingering longer than such business required. Luther had shown what witnesses initially interpreted as appropriate interest in tenant families' welfare, asking about children's health, commenting on their growth, occasionally bringing small gifts. but several people noted that his attention focused disproportionately on the Dunsworths, and specifically on Cora. He knew details about the child's routine that seemed excessive for a landlord's oversight. What time she typically went to the creek, which paths she preferred when she was left unsupervised. Thomas Murdaugh, who had participated in the 1878 search, recalled something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now carried different weight. Luther had been particularly insistent about searching certain areas, directing groups away from some sections while volunteering to cover others alone. The hollow where Cora was eventually found had been in a section Luther claimed to have searched thoroughly, reporting no findings. More witnesses came forward after learning of Luther's questioning. Sarah Cutler, who operated a general store in the nearest settlement, remembered Luther purchasing supplies in quantities that seemed unusual for a man living alone. Every few weeks throughout the years after Cora's disappearance, he would buy cornmeal, dried beans, and preserved goods, explaining when asked that he maintained a hunting camp and preferred to keep it stocked. The storekeeper's records, which she maintained meticulously, showed these purchases continued with remarkable regularity from late 1878 through early October 1882, when they abruptly ceased. The timing aligned precisely with Cora's captivity period. The final purchase had occurred in early September, which explained why the surveyors had found diminished supplies at the shelter, and why Cora might have been approaching starvation had she not been discovered when she was. Dr. Latimer contributed a deeply troubling observation from his examination of Cora. The child's physical development suggested severe nutritional deprivation and lack of proper care, but she showed no signs of having been restrained by ropes or chains. Her captivity had been maintained through isolation and psychological control, rather than physical bondage. This suggested a captor who visited regularly, who could have simply taken her back to civilization, but chose instead to maintain her imprisonment in that remote hollow. Sheriff Gable obtained permission to search Luther's cabin more thoroughly. Hidden in a gap between the cabin's log walls, investigators found papers that Luther had clearly never intended anyone to see. These writings, dating back to 1874, documented an escalating fixation on the Dunsworth family. Early entries described observations of their daily life in language that attempted objectivity but revealed obsessive attention to detail. Later entries grew more disturbing, containing what could only be described as plans. Luther had sketched maps of the hollow, noting sightlines and access routes. He had written descriptions of how supplies might be cached and transported without detection. He had calculated what provisions would be necessary to sustain someone in isolation. These were not idle fantasies, but methodical preparations for what he eventually carried out. Most chilling were entries written after Cora's disappearance. Luther described his participation in the search in terms that revealed satisfaction rather than concern. He wrote about redirecting search parties, about ensuring certain areas remained unexplored, about maintaining appropriate displays of worry while knowing exactly where the missing child was located. The writings demonstrated not just premeditation, but a disturbing pleasure in the deception he had successfully maintained. One passage, dated November 1878, 2 months after the abduction, was particularly revealing. Luther wrote about visiting the hollow, about the necessity of keeping the child isolated to ensure she would not reveal what had happened, about his belief that given enough time, she would forget her previous life entirely. The entry demonstrated both the calculated nature of his crime and a fundamental misunderstanding of how human memory and attachment function. Neighbors who had known Luther for years struggled to reconcile these revelations with the man they thought they knew. He had been quiet, but not reclusive, helpful during community emergencies, appropriate in his interactions. Several people admitted they had noticed his interest in the Dunsworth family, but had interpreted it as concern for tenants' welfare rather than something predatory. The pattern that emerged from testimony and documentation painted a picture of a crime that had been years in planning and execution. Luther had studied the family, learned their routines, identified vulnerabilities. He had prepared the hollow in advance, testing routes and ensuring the location's isolation. When opportunity presented itself that September day in 1878, he had been ready to act on plans he had been developing for years. The question that troubled everyone involved in the investigation was how such extensive preparation and regular visits to a remote location could have gone completely unnoticed. The answer lay partly in the vastness of the mountain terrain and partly in Luther's social position. His comings and goings attracted no particular attention because his status gave him freedom of movement that others lacked. His family's land ownership meant he had legitimate reasons to travel to remote areas. His wealth meant he could purchase supplies without raising suspicion about their purpose. But the deeper answer involved something more troubling: the community's collective failure to recognize predatory behavior when it was occurring in plain sight, masked by social norms that discouraged questioning the actions of wealthy, influential families. The evidence Sheriff Gable had accumulated would have been sufficient to arrest and charge any ordinary citizen of Watauga County. But Luther Vesey was not ordinary, and the obstacles to prosecution revealed systemic failures that extended far beyond one man's crimes. Judge Samuel Pritchett, who would hear any criminal charges, maintained extensive business dealings with Edmund Vesey. The judge's appointment to the bench had been facilitated by recommendations from the Vesey family, and his continuation in that position depended partly on maintaining good relationships with the county's most influential residents. When Sheriff Gable presented his evidence, Judge Pritchett expressed concern about rushing to judgment against a respected family based on what he characterized as circumstantial findings. The prosecuting attorney, Daniel Fentress, faced similar pressures. His practice depended on clients from prominent families, and antagonizing the Veseys would have professional consequences, extending beyond this single case. During preliminary discussions about charges, Fentress repeatedly emphasized the difficulties of prosecution: Cora's inability to provide clear testimony, the challenge of proving intent, the absence of witnesses to the actual abduction. Edmund Vesey deployed his influence methodically. He visited Judge Pritchett privately, emphasizing his brother's history of mental instability and suggesting that any crime, if proven, resulted from diminished capacity rather than criminal intent. He spoke with county commissioners about the economic impact of scandalizing a family whose business activities employed dozens of residents. He reminded the prosecuting attorney of past favors and future considerations. Meanwhile, community reaction split along lines that reflected the county's social divisions. Tenant families and those of modest means expressed outrage that Luther remained free while evidence of his guilt accumulated. They organized meetings, drafted petitions, and demanded action from officials who seemed more concerned with protecting privilege than delivering justice. Wealthier residents and those connected to the Vesey family, through business or social ties, adopted different positions. Some expressed skepticism about the evidence, suggesting alternative explanations or questioning Sheriff Gable's investigative methods. Others acknowledged Luther's probable guilt, but argued for measured responses that considered his family's contributions to the community. A few stated plainly that ruining a prominent family over one tenant's child seemed disproportionate. The Dunsworth family found themselves at the center of this divide. As tenants on Vesey land, their position was particularly vulnerable. Edmund Vesey made clear, through intermediaries, that continued cooperation with prosecution might result in termination of their tenancy. Where would they go with 3 children and no resources? How would they survive without access to land they could farm? Emmett Dunsworth faced an impossible choice. Pursuing justice for his daughter meant risking homelessness and destitution for his entire family. Accepting some compromise meant allowing the man who had stolen 4 years of Cora's life to escape full accountability. The weight of this decision, compounded by 4 years of grief and the trauma of Cora's current condition, pushed him toward positions he had never imagined having to consider. Ada Dunsworth refused compromise. She attended every meeting, spoke to every official who would listen, insisted that Luther's wealth should not protect him from consequences. Her determination inspired some community members, but alienated others who saw her persistence as inappropriate for a woman of her social station. She received warnings, some subtle and some explicit, about the dangers of challenging powerful families. Sheriff Gable found his authority increasingly constrained. Judge Pritchett delayed hearings, requested additional evidence, questioned the admissibility of items found during searches. The prosecuting attorney suggested reduced charges that might be easier to prove, but carried minimal penalties. Edmund Vesey's lawyers filed motions challenging every aspect of the investigation, tying up proceedings in legal technicalities that required time and resources Sheriff Gable did not possess. The case that should have been straightforward became mired in procedural obstacles that served no purpose except delay and frustration. Witnesses who had been willing to testify began reconsidering after visits from people connected to the Vesey family. Some reported threats to their employment or tenancy. Others simply lost confidence that the system would deliver justice regardless of their participation. Dr. Latimer attempted to document Cora's condition in ways that might support prosecution, but her inability to communicate clearly limited what testimony she could provide. The law in 1882 North Carolina required victim testimony in such cases, and Cora's traumatized silence created legal obstacles that Luther's attorneys exploited relentlessly. They argued that without direct testimony about what had occurred, the prosecution could not prove specific criminal acts beyond unlawful confinement. 3 months after Cora's discovery, Luther Vesey remained free, living in his cabin, restricted only by an order to stay away from the Dunsworth family. The evidence sat in Sheriff Gable's office, documented and preserved, but seemingly insufficient to overcome the institutional resistance that wealth and influence could purchase. Community meetings grew more heated as frustration mounted. Some residents talked about taking matters into their own hands, forcing a justice that the legal system seemed unwilling to provide. Sheriff Gable found himself in the position of protecting Luther Vesey from potential vigilante action, while simultaneously trying to build a case against him, a contradiction that reflected the broader failures of a system designed to serve some citizens more faithfully than others. The power imbalance that had enabled Luther's crime in the first place now threatened to prevent any meaningful accountability. The same isolation that had hidden Cora's captivity, the same social structures that had given Luther freedom to move unsupervised through remote areas, the same wealth that had purchased supplies without suspicion, all these factors now worked to shield him from consequences. The system had failed to protect Cora Dunsworth in 1878, and it was failing her again in 1883, for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence or justice, and everything to do with whose lives the law was designed to value. The arrest finally came in March 1883, 5 months after Cora's discovery. What forced action was not new evidence, but external pressure that even the Vesey family's influence could not fully contain. News of the case had spread beyond Watauga County, picked up by newspapers in larger cities where the details shocked readers and generated demands for accountability. The Raleigh Observer published a detailed account in February, describing the 4-year captivity and the apparent obstruction of justice by local officials. Other papers followed, some portraying the case as evidence of corruption in mountain counties, others focusing on the dramatic rescue and the child's suffering. The attention brought scrutiny that made continued inaction politically untenable for Judge Pritchett and prosecuting attorney Fentress. Luther Vesey was charged with abduction and unlawful confinement. More serious charges that might have been applicable were deliberately omitted, a compromise that reflected the ongoing influence of his family's legal team. Edmund Vesey hired 3 attorneys from outside the county, experienced lawyers who understood how to exploit every technicality and procedural requirement. The trial began in May 1883 at the county courthouse. The building filled beyond capacity, with spectators standing in hallways and crowds gathering outside. The case had become a referendum on whether justice applied equally to all citizens or remained contingent on wealth and social position. Sheriff Gable testified first, describing the discovery of the shelter and the evidence collected there. He presented the journal entries, the stolen items from the Dunsworth cabin, the supplies purchased from Sarah Cutler's store. His testimony was methodical and damning, building a timeline that connected Luther to every aspect of the crime. The defense attorneys attacked his credibility immediately. They questioned his investigative methods, suggested evidence had been planted or contaminated, implied that his enmity toward the Vesey family motivated false accusations. Judge Pritchett sustained many of their objections, limiting what testimony the jury could consider. Ada Dunsworth testified about the day Cora disappeared, about the items found in Luther's possession, about his unusual attention to her daughter in the years before the abduction. Her testimony was emotional but precise, and the defense's attempts to discredit her based on her social status generated visible discomfort among some jury members who recognized the tactic for what it was. Dr. Latimer provided medical testimony about Cora's condition when found, carefully describing the effects of prolonged isolation and inadequate care without graphic details that might prejudice the jury. He explained that her inability to communicate clearly resulted from trauma, not from any inherent incapacity, and that her condition was consistent with years of deliberate confinement. The defense presented Luther's mental state as their primary argument. They called witnesses who testified about his eccentric behavior, his preference for isolation, his difficulty maintaining normal social relationships. They suggested that if he had taken Cora, it resulted from confused thinking rather than criminal intent, that he lacked the capacity to understand the wrongness of his actions. This strategy infuriated many observers, who recognized it as an attempt to use wealth to purchase a medical excuse for inexcusable behavior. Luther's journal entries demonstrated careful planning and awareness of consequences. His success in evading detection for 4 years showed calculated deception. The suggestion that he was too mentally impaired to be held responsible contradicted all evidence of his methodical preparation and execution. Cora was not called to testify. Prosecuting attorney Fentress decided her limited ability to communicate would be exploited by the defense, and her presence in court might cause additional trauma. without producing testimony that would strengthen the case. This decision was both compassionate and pragmatic, though it meant the jury never heard directly from the victim about her ordeal. The trial lasted 8 days. Closing arguments revealed the divide in how the case was interpreted. Fentress portrayed Luther as a calculating predator who had used his social position and geographic knowledge to commit and conceal a terrible crime. The defense painted him as a troubled man whose actions, while regrettable, resulted from mental illness rather than criminal malice. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict, when it came, reflected the compromises that had characterized the entire proceedings. Luther Vesey was found guilty of abduction and unlawful confinement. He was acquitted of additional charges that carried longer sentences, with the jury apparently accepting the defense's claims about his diminished mental capacity. The sentence was 5 years imprisonment. Judge Pritchett explained that he had considered Luther's lack of prior criminal history, his family's standing in the community, and the medical testimony about his mental state. Give years for stealing 4 years of a child's life, for causing trauma that would affect her permanently, for crimes that would have resulted in far harsher punishment had they been committed by someone without wealth and influence. The courtroom erupted. Ada Dunsworth stood and spoke words that newspapers later reported verbatim. She said that justice in Watauga County was for sale, that her daughter's suffering had been assigned a price, and that price had been negotiated down by lawyers and influence until it became almost meaningless. She said that everyone present knew Luther deserved far worse, but that knowing and acting were different things when the guilty belonged to powerful families. Sheriff Gable sat through the sentencing with an expression that witnesses described as resignation rather than satisfaction. He had gathered overwhelming evidence, yet the system he served had processed that evidence through filters of class and privilege until it produced a result that served everyone's interests except those of the victim and her family. Luther Vesey was taken into custody to begin his sentence at the state prison. Edmund Vesey immediately filed appeals, though these would ultimately fail. The trial concluded, verdicts were recorded, and the legal system declared the matter resolved. But resolution and justice were not the same thing, a distinction that everyone involved understood, even if few stated it explicitly. Luther Vesey served 3 years of his 5-year sentence before being released on parole in 1886. His early release, granted due to what prison officials described as good behavior and continued claims of mental fragility, sparked renewed outrage in communities that had followed the case. By the time he returned to Watauga County, the Dunsworth family had already left. Emmett and Ada had made the decision to relocate in 1884, little more than a year after the trial concluded. The continued presence on Vesey land had become unbearable, every day a reminder of the power structures that had enabled their daughter's suffering and then mitigated her abductor's punishment. They moved to Tennessee, settling in a community where their history was unknown, and they could attempt to rebuild lives that had been fundamentally altered. Cora went with them, though the child who left North Carolina bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old who had disappeared in 1878. At 15, she remained largely nonverbal, communicating through gestures and occasional single words. Dr. Latimer had examined her multiple times during the years following her rescue, documenting developmental delays and psychological trauma that he believed would persist throughout her life. She showed extreme anxiety around unfamiliar people, particularly men. Loud noises caused visible distress. She could not tolerate enclosed spaces, even the family's cabin, and preferred to spend time outdoors, where she could see approaches from all directions. Her parents learned to interpret her limited communications and developed routines that provided structure without triggering the panic that unpredictability could cause. The younger Dunsworth children grew up understanding their sister's needs without fully comprehending their origin. They were protective of Cora, patient with her limitations, and learned early that their family carried burdens that other families did not. The move to Tennessee provided some relief from the constant reminders of what had occurred, but it could not erase the fundamental damage that 4 years of isolation had inflicted. Ada Dunsworth never recovered from what she described as the double tragedy. First losing her daughter to abduction, then losing her again to the trauma that made full recovery impossible. She aged rapidly in the years following the trial, her health declining in ways that suggested grief could inflict physical as well as emotional damage. She died in 1892 at 43 years old, exhausted by struggles that had consumed her adult life. Emmett lived longer, but never remarried after Ada's death. He continued working small farms, maintaining a household for his children, including Cora, who remained dependent on family care. He rarely spoke about the events in North Carolina, treating that period as a closed chapter that discussing would not improve. When he died in 1907, his obituary made no mention of the case that had defined his middle years. Cora Dunsworth lived until 1926, reaching 48 years despite the hardships she had endured. She never married, never lived independently, and never recovered the capacity for normal social interaction that 4 years of captivity had stolen. Her younger siblings cared for her after their father's death, maintaining the protective environment she required. When she died, her death certificate listed natural causes, a bureaucratic summary that captured nothing of the unnatural circumstances that had shaped her existence. The case became a footnote in Appalachian legal history, occasionally referenced in discussions of how isolated communities dealt with crimes against children. The courthouse records remained, documenting in careful legal language events that defied neutral description. Local historians occasionally discovered the files and retold the story, though details became confused over generations, and the social context that had enabled both the crime and its inadequate punishment faded from memory. Luther Vesey lived quietly after his release, maintaining residence in a small cabin far from his former property. He died in 1897 at 52 years old. His obituary, published in the county newspaper, made no mention of his conviction or imprisonment. The Vesey family's influence extended even to how their disgraced member would be remembered, editing the historical record to protect a reputation that the facts did not support. The hollow where Cora had been held gradually returned to wilderness. The shelter collapsed, reclaimed by weather and vegetation. Hikers occasionally stumbled upon remnants, rotted logs, rusted nails, evidence of human construction in a place that seemed to deny human presence. Most passed by without recognizing what they had found. The case stands as documentation of how geographic isolation and social inequality could enable predatory behavior and then obstruct justice when that behavior was finally exposed. It demonstrates the limitations of legal systems designed to protect some citizens more faithfully than others, and the permanent damage that results when children become victims of both individual criminals and institutional failures. Cora Dunsworth's story did not end with her rescue. The 4 years she spent in that mountain hollow defined the remaining 44 years of her life, a ratio that illustrates how trauma extends far beyond the immediate period of victimization. Her inability to recover fully was not a personal failing, but a predictable consequence of what had been done to her during years when her mind and identity were still forming. The hikers who discovered her in October 1882 gave her back her life, but they could not give her back what those 4 years had taken. That loss remained permanent, a theft for which 5 years' imprisonment, reduced to 3, represented justice only in the most technical and inadequate sense. The mountains that had hidden her captivity kept their secrets long after the people involved had died. But the records remain, preserved in courthouse archives and newspaper accounts, evidence that some crimes echo across generations, and that the failure to protect the vulnerable creates damage that time cannot fully repair. If this story disturbed you, that discomfort is appropriate. These cases existed, they shaped real lives, and they reveal truths about power and justice that remain relevant today. Hit that like button if you believe these stories need to be told, no matter how dark they become. Subscribe to this channel because we're committed to uncovering the cases that history tried to bury, the victims who deserved better, and the systems that failed them. The algorithm buries uncomfortable truths unless people like you push back. Every subscription is a vote that these stories matter. What case should we investigate next? Tell us in the comments. And remember, the darkest chapters of history are the ones we're most tempted to forget.